Hey everyone, Dingo here, and welcome to the Saffron Academy podcast. The objective of this podcast is to be an additional educational resource for our viewers. Saffron Finance does not endorse the viewpoints shared in these conversations, nor should this be construed as any kind of financial advice. But we are interested in giving exposure to a wide range of brilliant investors, developers, entrepreneurs, traders, and so much more. If you have an idea for a topic or a particular guest request, feel free to write into the show at dingo@saffron.finance.
This week, Zack interviews Mark Richardson at Bancor. Mark talks about his scientific background and how the COVID pandemic led him to switching career paths. They go on to talk about the past and future of Bancor, Saffron Finance's whitelisting on Bancor, the beginnings of DeFi, and so much more. Zack has really put together an incredible episode here with Mark, and I can't wait for you guys to check it out.
Hey guys, so as you know, I'm Zack, and I'm very excited to have Mark Richardson of Bancor on the podcast today. Mark, thanks so much for joining me, and how's your day going so far?
Oh, my pleasure, Zach. Thank you so much for having me. It's 10 o'clock in the morning for me right now, so my day is just beginning.
Awesome. So we're going to start off with the old faithful of questions, so to speak. I believe when we had Meltem Demers on the show, she referred to it as the rabbit hole question, which is basically tell us how you first got into or heard about crypto and Bitcoin.
Yeah, certainly. So I think the first I ever heard about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin was like way back in 2010. I remember I was on YouTube and there was a YouTuber called Meme Molly that I used to watch frequently, and she had a small anecdote about Bitcoin and what cryptocurrency is, and so I remember learning about it back then, but unfortunately I didn't buy anything. If I could go back now, I'm sure that I would have corrected that.
Cool. Yeah. And just kind of on that same line of questioning, one thing I love to ask our guests about is the moment you decided or at least started considering crypto as a career path, because as we both know, as our listeners know, there are a lot of investors or fans or people who have interest in the space, but they don't necessarily see it as an option for their main occupation. So I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about kind of that moment where you realized, like, hey, maybe beyond something I'd be interested in investing in, maybe this is something I can do as a job.
Yeah, for sure. So my transition into cryptocurrency was, I think, is pretty atypical. So I didn't come from the traditional finance sector or investing or anything like that. I was actually a research scientist for 14 years. And what kind of I think put me straight into crypto was that I'd set up a very large research stint in Germany. I was supposed to go to the Max Planck Institute for Colloids and Surfaces. I had a research grant to complete a leg of work under the supervision of Peter Seeberger. This was sponsored by the German government. This was a DAAD research stay. And I was really looking forward to it. I had basically done 12 months of preparation for this thing. And I was supposed to arrive in Berlin, I think it was either March or April in 2020. And it was, my flight out of the country was about a week and a half, I think, after Australia closed its borders due to the pandemic. I live in Melbourne, in Australia, and we had one of the longest and harshest lockdowns, I think, of certainly anywhere in the country, but I also think anywhere in the world. I was in and out of the, there was a period of about 6 months where I didn't really set foot in the lab in any meaningful sense. And even if I was heading into work as usual, it wouldn't really be clear what I would be doing there, seeing as most of the work that I'd been preparing for was supposed to be taking place in Germany with the machines that Peter Seeberger had in his lab. So I basically was at home for sort of 6 to 9 months with very little to do. And I could see a huge amount of what I'd been preparing for, and what was supposed to be a significant step forward for my career, sort of evaporating. And so I really started to sort of look around for what was in demand. For a long time, I've been watching the cryptocurrency scene evolve. I've often, been watching DeFi in particular evolve with interest. And so I started spending all of this time that I had sort of getting well up to speed on what all of the major developments had been and what the major projects were. I was involving myself with a couple of the different DeFi communities. I was a prominent community member, I think, in the Kyber Swap community, obviously with Bancor. I was basically experimenting with, what community involvement with these different projects would look like, but also getting, well up to speed on what the philosophies and tokenomics of all of these different projects actually was, and trying to decide which one would be, which would be the most likely to have a long-term value proposition, not just to DeFi and to blockchain, but to the world and to the people living in it. And so when Bancor announced their DAO with the release of version 2.1 in October of 2020, I was kind of very well primed, with a lot of the research that I'd been doing in this space to sort of lead the community as the DAO sort of started to launch. I was one of the community members that wrote some of the sort of formative policy for how the DAO should operate, the supermajority rules for the Bancor's process, and the quorum percentages and things like that were some of the policies that I wrote in the beginning. And I was also on all of the Bancor community calls. At that time, there wasn't that many of us, but we started thinking about what Bancor's long-term value proposition was going to be, and what sort of features and products Bancor should develop. And within about 2 months of the Bancor DAO launching, I was collaborating with the Bancor founders on a interest-free and liquidation-free credit system that was leveraging Bancor's unique tokenomics. This eventually launched as the Bancor Vortex, and it became a very big part of Bancor's narrative, and I still think it's one of the most unique and interesting DeFi products around. So shortly after that launched and following its success, the Bancor Foundation reached out to me with an offer to commence full-time research for them, and my scientific career hadn't really bounced back at all, so I didn't see any reason to stick with it. And so I turned my back on scientific research and began DeFi research, and I haven't looked back.
Awesome, man. Yeah. And I know those research grants are not easy to come by. And I'm sure, like a lot of people, it was very tough to realize that COVID is kind of taking a lot away from you. But I really do think that, crypto and DeFi specifically has this kind of arms wide open mentality. And it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are, but as long as you're willing to put in the work, as long as you're willing to educate yourself, the community is really welcoming, and there's always value to add. So I think that was a really cool, very interesting story as well. And I'm just wondering, since we're kind of jumping from 2010 to basically present day, not too long ago, um, were you keeping tabs that whole time on crypto and DeFi, or were you kind of, at least for a period of time, checked out, or were you always kind of, even when you were in your scientific pursuits, were you keeping an eye on what was going on?
No, I tend to be. I'm a pretty obsessive person by nature, and so when I was in science, I was in it, body and soul.
Mhm.
I spent 4 years in California. I was a lecturer for the chemistry department there for a little while for UCI.
Mhm.
And I remember when I was there, this was when, I was there from 2015 to 2019. And so I think right at the beginning of that leg of it, or, about a year in, is when Ethereum began to launch. And so there are these kinds of punctuation marks, I would say, throughout my scientific career that sort of mark these really significant developments in cryptocurrency. So in 2010, that was right at the end of my honors year. And I think the reason I was watching, YouTube and learning about it was because I was procrastinating writing my thesis on it. And, being my first postdoc in California and learning about Ethereum when I was over there. Basically, I was always kind of aware of it. It was always something in the background that I was occasionally distracted by, I think you could say.
Yeah.
So it never really sort of, I never really wanted to spend too much time on it. As a young scientist, I also didn't have that much money to throw around, so I wasn't looking to invest or anything like that. Um, but it was something that I was always aware of. I was always excited by, and I was always convinced that we were sort of at the beginning of this new industrial age, right, of public blockchains and what they could do for society. So yeah, I was never keeping very close tabs on it, I think, as you put it, but I could always see it, right, in my peripheral vision.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely know what you mean. And I think I mean, it says a lot about all of our guests who come on here that they really decided to take that plunge. But particularly for you, such a stark, kind of change in direction is really cool. And I think that's one of the first times I've heard something like that. So I'm sure you're bringing such a unique perspective to the Bancor team. So that's very cool, and it's no wonder why they reached out and gave you an offer. I think that also speaks to a lot too, that you weren't even necessarily soliciting that. Um, but I would want to hear. I mean, obviously, you weren't there in the start, and they were
Right.
a very early a team in this space and really blazing trails. So I was just wondering if, do you think that kind of experience and all of those kind of wisdoms that come along the way with being the first or being a pioneer, is there kind of a holdover effect on the culture of Bancor, whether it's the community, whether it's the team? Is there anything specific you think that was picked up during that process that still informs the way you guys are approaching things today? Or do you think that it's a little bit more of a lot of people are moving fast and breaking things, and you're just kind of rolling with the punches, and what's new is what's most important?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question, and there's no sort of clean answer for it. I think it would be naive to assume that being an older project and having this wealth of experience, the team, the protocol, and the community, um, they're experience of cryptocurrency and of DeFi is going to be nuanced, right, by this kind of change in narrative. So I think for example, you know, like for the Sushi Swap community and the Uniswap community, it's been nothing but a party, right, since the birth of these projects.
Yeah.
But for Bancor, right, for starting back in 2017 in you know the ICO era, followed by you know a 3-year bear market, you know that was. We still have community members, right? A lot of our community members were around for the ICO and first invested during the ICO. And so they, you know, they kind of carry a chip on their shoulder a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that that's totally justified. And the other thing is that I think the DeFi community has just exploded over the last year. And for a lot of the people that are in it now, things like this, like regulation talk and you know government intervention and KYC and all this kind of stuff. For them, this is like brand new ideas, and they're like, you know, I thought this was blockchain. I thought that this was, you know, private and anonymous, and this kind of this kind of mentality, but not realizing that this is like the second or third time that we've kind of this industry has had this conversation. It might be sort of the most significant. It certainly has more momentum behind it now than it has before. But for Bancor, we're kind of looking around, seeing everyone panic, thinking, well, you know, we've got a very long-standing and strong relationship with regulators. The first version of Bancor, right, Bancor version 1, it was a KYC protocol because that was the legal advice that we had at the time. And it was, developed and launched under the supervision of the Swiss regulator, because with the Bancor Foundation is still a Swiss nonprofit and makes sure that we are observing, both Swiss and European regulatory practices as well as the US regulatory practices. We've also had. We've also been through the court system in the United States. It took a little while, but there are a couple of, let's say, opportunistic career litigators that took the opportunity after the ICO bubble started to burst to start taking whatever projects they could through the court system, trying to accuse them of selling unregistered securities. And so really the Bancor team and the Bancor Foundation were a part of that first wave of projects that had to actually prove their mettle in one of the harshest environments that cryptocurrency has ever seen, right, during the 2017 to 2020 bear market. And while regulators were really pressuring projects like ours to really demonstrate that they weren't actually qualified as a security. So we've been through all of that process. And, I think that we are sort of war hardened as a result. But I think that is, to our benefit. I think that we're much harder to scare. I think our community is a lot more level-headed, a lot more sort of long-term thinking, not as hype driven and not so easily distracted, right, by fast emerging trends or things like that, right, where the community project as a whole has a an earned erudition in cryptocurrency culture, you could say.
Yeah.
And so, that it certainly changes the way that we approach things, but I think that it is it's a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically any length of time of experience, rather, any length of time you've spent within the crypto space is invaluable, and for the reasons that you just mentioned, there's, particularly in this space, there's so many different things that seem to rear their head again and again, whether it's what people call China FUD or regulatory threats or kind of these incremental headlines of, well, they might do this, and then, oh, they're proposing it, but it's not passed, or, kind of all these things that are, I'm not sure what the motivation is, whether it's people trying to get clicks or whatever. But the bottom line is they're certainly out there, and you can kind of see who they're affecting and scaring, or, whatever effect it is. You can see who's being kind of, whether they're changing their strategy based on that, or whether they know that, hey, this isn't the first rodeo. And I love what you said about, kind of these old school guys, because my story is that I was really into crypto back in 2013, probably 2013 to 2015 or so. And then I had a career in movies and TV, and that, you're working 14 hours a day. It took up most of my life. And when I came back, I realized there was such a narrative change of, like you said, all these people thinking that it should be anonymous and no fees, etc. And, you don't hear those people quite as much anymore.
Right.
At least they're not voicing those concerns. But if they are around, they are those kind of battle-hardened people who know that, listen, we've seen this before, and everyone who's claiming that, we're screwed, or whatever the fear du jour is just kind of, another hurdle to jump through, and that we will get through it, because I think that the industry is overall aware of that, and very resilient. So that was a great answer, and it brought back so many memories of being at the Bitcoin Center back in 2013
Right,
on
yeah.
Wall Street, which was a wild time for sure. So it's a little different now, but I think that we're certainly better for it. But anyway, to rein the conversation in just a little bit, so I would love to hear, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear, about what you guys are working on over at Bancor. Obviously we talked about, kind of the past and what you guys had been through, but I would love to hear about what you're working on, what you specifically are excited about, and kind of like, what are the next steps you guys are taking, and what's the future of Bancor look like?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a really interesting narrative that kind of leads up to where we are in the present day, just with regards to the product development. So if you don't mind, I think that it'd be nice to sort of just quickly reflect on what the different versions of Bancor have been, and then we can talk a little bit about where we're going.
Yep. Please, I would love that.
Yeah, so the very first version of Bancor was the original AMM, right? This was E.L. Herzog, one of the Bancor founders, sort of conceived of the idea of the automatic market maker and pool tokens, and that sort of formed the original Bancor product. Now, the reason why this came into existence was that Bancor was already researching community currencies, and this was a product that it had in a bunch of different cells around the world, and all of these community currencies sort of started running into the same issue, and that is that they would run really well for a while, right? Like maybe the green grocer would have a community currency that allows him to exchange value with his hairdresser, or with the gas station or something. It would work for a time, but then eventually they would just lose momentum. And the reason for that loss of momentum is that these currencies had no way to know their value, right? You can't actually exchange value within that community to another community somewhere else, right? While these community currencies were extremely efficient, within themselves, all of the things that made them great were also the things that made it insular, right? As a part of a global connected community, these little miniature, economic bubbles. And I don't mean that in the sense that, a speculative bubble. I just mean the fact that it's isolated from everything else. It meant that these currencies had a shelf life, right? They were a blip, and was difficult to sustain. And so looking into why these currencies would fail, It really is, because you need to have someone who tells you what this currency is worth relative to other currencies. And if you've got something that is, that's only being used by, small communities in West Africa or something like that, there isn't really a professional market maker in the world that's really interested or incentivized to help you make markets with it, so that it can learn what its international value is, right? What its exchange rate should be with the US dollar or with the euro or anything like that. And so that's where AMMs actually came from. And I think that this gets lost, right? This is a very important part of the narrative for DeFi, is that AMMs weren't, a greedy, fintech startup idea. They were really born out of necessity, and it really was to serve the needs of these little, splinter cells around the world that were still, experimenting with this idea of cryptocurrency to serve community needs in the wake of, their own failed national currency. So that was where the AMM came from, and that was sort of Bancor version 1. But at that stage, like I said earlier in this presentation, that all of the legal advice up to then was still that it's still an exchange, and whatever currencies that you have on there should be treated like any other sort of any other kind of security that is being traded on a regular exchange. So Bancor version 1 really looked a lot like something like, Binance or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or something like that. It was really, it was much smaller than that and dealing with obviously a very different type of asset. But the sort of way that it was operated was as if it really was, held to the same standards as a regular exchange was. And during that time, right, this is the ICO era, having a token back then was kind of a dirty idea. I'm sure that you would remember this, Zach, right? It was
definitely.
Right. Like Vitalik Buterin in particular was extremely upset that token projects were launching and using ERC20 assets as a way to sort of crowdfund stuff. And Vitalik specifically, but also generally the rest of the Ethereum Foundation was extremely critical of Bancor, because they thought that they didn't mind the AMM idea. In fact, they quite liked the AMM idea, but they had this problem with BNT being used as the universal conduit through which these other cryptocurrencies realize their value. They thought that Ethereum, right, should be the asset that's used, which of course, of course, right, of course, which is, it's interesting to look back on that now, because now Ethereum, like the actual Ethereum token, has issues with smart contracts, and we have to wrap it inside an ERC20 in order to use it in AMMs like Uniswap. But putting that to the side for a second.
Forgetting about that.
Forget about that for just a second. Yeah. So so there was this pushback, and then a lot of these ICOs actually did turn out to be fraudulent. I think obviously Bancor wasn't, and many of the ICOs weren't, but these token projects suddenly had a very bad name, right? They started to look very scammy, very suspicious, and so that kind of tainted the beginning of DeFi, right? If you've got the Ethereum Foundation being critical of your model, and then you've got it coming out of the woodwork that actually a lot of these ICOs were criminal enterprises, it didn't get off to the best start. But it actually persisted, and it the Bancor exchange, it did attract exactly the sort of attention that we thought that it would. I think that the first liquidity pool was set up by Gnosis, and back then they weren't called liquidity pools. I think they were called token relays. And then shortly after that, there was the power token, which is the power ledger energy. So basically, there were these cryptocurrency projects, other ICO era projects that immediately saw the value in being able to establish liquidity on Ethereum without having to talk directly to a professional market maker. Because, market makers aren't cheap. You usually have to either loan them a bunch of money to make markets for you, or they will actually, just flat out charge you to take your token to an exchange. And so this was a huge overhead that I think a lot of projects didn't really want to deal with. And at that time as well, people take it for granted now that things like Binance and Kraken are so well established. In 2017, that really wasn't the case. A lot of these exchanges were still like pretty shady places. And it didn't have the veneer that it does today. So, being able to have a decentralized, totally transparent way of providing liquidity on Ethereum, the people that we built the protocol for, they immediately started using it. But it was a pain, right? The Swiss regulator was making sure that if you wanted to start a liquidity pool back then, we literally sent you paperwork, right, that you would have to fill out.
Oh,
and
wow.
Then, I'm not even kidding, right? We still have all of these things on file. We still have the original Gnosis and PowerPool paperwork on file. It's still with the foundation. And so, meanwhile, right, while Bancor is sort of churning away trying to establish this new type of exchange, the Ethereum Foundation funds Hayden Adams to essentially fork the Bancor contracts, pull out the BNT token, which was the thing that they always had a problem with, and replace it with Ethereum as the base asset. Now, it's usually sort of told in exactly that way, except maybe without necessarily the fact that the Ethereum Foundation was critical of BNT from the start. But I do want to give credit to Hayden. The Uniswap V1 and V2 contracts, they are extremely efficient. He's a very talented developer, and Uniswap was a terrific product. And one of the things that it did extremely well was completely ignore regulation. So where Bancor is still insisting that project teams fill out these forms and things, and our advice at the time as well was you can't even mention fees, right? Even though the pools were earning fees for liquidity providers, our lawyers were like, don't ever say that, because that you enter into this whole other world of pain, and we just don't want to go there. But then Uniswap comes out and with its product and immediately starts telling people that they can earn fees, and it's trying to encourage community members to establish their own liquidity pools, not just token projects. And so it really sort of Uniswap was a really interesting experiment in what happens if we just ignore regulatory advice, I think. And it demonstrated that you can do that, and nothing bad happens. And so you were sort of inspired by that, I think. And I was like, okay, right. So we've been too, maybe too observant, if that's such a thing. I don't think that anyone would be critical of the approach that we took. Right, the first one through the gates is kind of has the most to lose, and given the climate that Bancor was set up in, I don't think anyone would ever be. I don't think anyone would blame us for taking the approach that we did. But
it was the right move at that time. And there was no precedent. There was really no precedent, and it was such an aggressive, like you said, with those litigators. I mean, your number one mission is basically to avoid anything worse happening.
Exactly right. And for Uniswap as well to be an American project means that effectively whatever they're doing is likely under very close supervision of the American regulator.
Yeah.
And so if it persisted past that, then probably there's not so much to worry about. And so the legal advice changed a little bit because now there's a precedent, and we started to open it up a little bit more. Right, you no longer have to fill out this paperwork and things. During that time, though, right, some other versions of the technology that Bancor developed had started to appear elsewhere. And this is something, another part of the narrative that I think people miss. So, for example, the Bancor protocol had already started to introduce things like dynamic weights, and this is this wasn't a part of our white paper, but this was some of that initial theory was refined and then formalized by Balancer, and that became sort of the Balancer protocol. And while that was occurring, Bancor was developing this, quietly in the background, this idea that the dynamic weights could be used to address a problem that we kind of discovered with the launch of AMMs, which we now call impermanent loss. And that the whole industry, I think, is slowly, it took a little while. I thought everyone knew about it last year, but I still meet community members that are learning about it for the first time, usually with a broken heart.
Why are my assets different?
Yeah, exactly. How did I lose money doing this?
Yeah,
I thought it's
exactly.
supposed to make money. And so, yeah, Bancor really first described impermanent loss, concisely, and immediately began working on ways to alleviate it, because it doesn't make sense, right? If you're contributing to the DeFi economy and providing value, it doesn't make sense that you should be financially disincentivized from performing that duty. So this idea of using dynamic weights to try and sort of match secondary market prices under the influence of an oracle started to become extremely interesting. Unfortunately, this, I think at the time that they started to develop this technology, it wasn't immediately clear just how complicated it was going to be. I've just, as I've become, up to speed on Bancor's previous research, I've just recently, with the stuff I'm researching right now, gone back and revisited what we're talking about, which is their version 2. This was released in April of last year, and it's a thing of beauty. It really, really is. There's some of the understanding the mathematics of how version 2 achieved what it achieved. It takes a lot of time. This is a sit down and study this kind of thing, quiz yourself, make sure you've got Wikipedia open, because you're going to be introduced to operators that don't usually show up in AMM math. But yeah, it was really terrific. And in the beginning, it was actually quite successful. So version 2 launched. It was the first AMM to be fully integrated with Chainlink. And it used Chainlink price feeds to do exactly what I just said. It basically adjusted the rates that the AMM is quoting to users based on what's happening in secondary markets. And that meant that it was able to anticipate these changes that would usually result in impermanent loss. And it was, for the other thing that version 2 did, was that it also, because you no longer have the requirement to sort of discover the price of the asset, right? Because it's mirroring exchanges coming from secondary sources. You no longer need to fund all of the curve at once. So the other interesting thing that Bancor version 2 did, again, I'll just remind everyone, this is in April of last year, was we introduced this thing that we called liquidity amplification, which of course today is now known as concentrated liquidity and is now associated with Uniswap v3. But we were doing it, quite a ways before Uniswap v3 came up with it. And this idea of liquidity amplification meant that you get very, very good slippage from the trading perspective. So really, Bancor version 2 was supposed to be this complete solution, right? The thing that DeFi had been waiting for. It had something for liquidity providers in the sense that the impermanent loss was alleviated, and it had something for traders because you could now process much larger transactions without having the same sort of price impact that you usually did. And so why don't we have version 2 anymore? It's because the way that it operated, and like I said, for a little while, it worked very well until arbitrageurs and Ethereum miners learned that if they manipulated the future price, they could anticipate what the oracle is going to do and then extract additional value from the pool. And this was kind of the tragedy of it, is that if if we were living in a perfect world, if Ethereum wasn't such an adversarial environment, I actually am convinced that Bancor version 2 would have been an enormous success. But just like being first through the gates with the AMM meant that we had to discover what impermanent loss was. Being first through the gates with this level of automation also meant that we were one of the first to the table for the discussion of what minor extractable value really means, and how protocols, no matter how well they're designed, can be abused by adversaries on Ethereum. And so that was really the downfall of version 2. And I think it was heartbreaking for not just the team but for the community to see something that had so much promise and be designed so well and be executed so well basically fall over because you basically are providing a financial incentive for someone to abuse the protocol. But at the same time, you can't be mad at people for attempting it, right? I think at the end of the day, all of finance, not just DeFi, is just a complicated game. And if you release something that's got a certain set of rules, and you're not doing anything necessarily that is, no one hacked Bancor version 2. Do you know what I mean? Like no one.
Yeah, of course.
They just decided, they just realized that they could do something else, right? They're kind of like they remind me a lot of like the speedrunners in video games. These people that find really obscure ways to like glitch out a certain part of the program in order to beat the game in like record time. So there's nothing wrong with it. It just meant that the protocol, for better or for worse, had to be retired, and we were left with, okay, what were the features of version 2 that people were really interested in? What if we had to save one of these aspects of it? What's the thing that we should save? And it turned out that traders weren't really that upset about losing that slippage thing, right? We were looking at Uniswap and SushiSwap and other things, and they were very popular despite having terrible slippage. And on version 2, we also didn't really hear much feedback from the trading community that said that this increase in the value in the value that they get per transaction was something that was really important to them. And even today, right, I talk to traders a lot. I interview community members and people that trade professionally, and slippage is something that actually really rarely comes up as a deal breaker for them. But the thing that is a deal breaker for lots of people is the impermanent loss issue, and that was the sticking point from version 2. That was the thing that people were like, if you're going to save something, let it be this, because I'm not going back to other AMMs, right? If I have to deal with impermanent loss ever again, I'm out of DeFi.
Yeah.
And so version 2.1 was basically, okay, there is another way that we can deal with impermanent loss, right? If you can't find a way to specifically prevent it, what you can do is basically make it obsolete through an approach that uses things like the laws of large numbers, right? Things that, exactly the same strategies that insurance companies use to transfer risk. We've basically built into the tokenomic design of BNT. And so that was how version 2.1 came into being. And it was with version 2.1 that the DAO was launched. And that's when I officially became, back then as a community member, but that's when I sort of became involved with the project and helped to steer its future. And so version 2.1 at the time, it was still kind of controversial. It was the first time that the BNT supply transitioned from being one of, a very fixed or, very static, I should say, to being one that's elastic. And people were worried, what does this mean for the value of BNT? Because there's going to be, we're going to be printing tokens, we're going to be burning tokens, and, a lot of people are still carrying this understanding of the Bitcoin narrative that the only way for things to appreciate in value is to become scarce, I think, which whether or not that's true or not is besides the point. There are different kinds of value, but it did mean that the version 2.1, it was an uneasy launch, right? Especially to go from version 2 to version 2.1 so quickly. The community was kind of already on the back foot, I think, is a fair observation. Right, it was kind of defensive about how to proceed. And this, by the way, was around the time where Uniswap, which was meant to be the AMM, right, the version of Bancor with no token, suddenly had its own token. The one thing that, the major criticism against Bancor that was brought against it by the Ethereum Foundation was the fact that it had an unnecessary token and that there was no need for it. You can just use Ethereum. And now Uniswap has its own token and that's turning into a party. So it was a rough launch to version 2.1. It really was. But I think that the community, they really did believe in it. The team was very, very good at spending sufficient time with everyone to sort of understand what the risks are, what we know and what we don't know, right? And how to monitor it. And the fact that it's the DAO's responsibility to make sure that the protocol remains healthy. And I'd say that that's actually worked out really well. I think we've got one of the best DAO structures anywhere in DeFi. All of the people that vote in proposals every week are stakeholders with something to lose, right? You can't actually participate in Bancor's governance unless you've got something staked in the protocol. So and now that we're coming up on 12 months, and that 12 months has seen some pretty dramatic price action. Right, we've seen both Bitcoin and Ethereum go completely crazy. I think when version 2.1 launched, BNT was like 50 cents, right? Mm-hmm. And we've seen it go up to like $10 and then back down to $4. So we've really explored that whole spectrum of volatility that cryptocurrency is known for, and exactly the sort of thing that people were let's say uneasy about ensuring the effects of, right? These are that kind of volatility is usually the thing that threatens the impermanent loss. And it turns out that the insurance model has been completely resilient against it. Even just over the last couple of days, you can see the BNT is standing up perfectly well against a lot of the economic forces that are acting against it. And so we've really sort of proven that the insurance model works. And so what we're working on now is, okay, what are those other things that we set out to do, right? What are the things that version 2 had that we kind of just put on the shelf for a moment while we figured out, how to release the best possible version of version 2.1. And so there are things that, that we kind of had to concede when we released version 2.1 that we're now interested in reviving. So things like, the capital efficient trading, things like, Bancor's composability. And we also want to make sure that the portability of the protocol is a lot higher than it is today. Version 2.1, with its insured user positions, which by the way are individual user positions, it makes the contracts extremely cumbersome, and it makes the protocol quite gas intensive for liquidity providers. And so these are things that we knew one day were going to have to be fixed. And so with version 3, which is what I've been researching, it feels like all year now. With version 3, we're basically, have pulled together all of that community feedback since October of last year, and we've prioritized everything, and we are kind of overhauling the whole thing, so that all of the features that it already has, they're going to be maintained and they're going to be better than they are now. They're going to be cheaper to use. They're going to be more lightweight. But then all of these other features, right? The things that the community have been asking for, the things that version 2 had that version 2.1 didn't have, these things are going to start trickling back in as we all, and also reintroduce the idea that Bancor can be multi-chain, right? So we can now start exploring the idea of having Bancor on Polygon, on Arbitrum when it's ready. on Avalanche, maybe on BSC, or any blockchain environment that has users and where there's demand for impermanent loss protection. Version 3 is designed to be able to go there very quickly.
Awesome, man. You taught me so much just in that response. And I thought I was pretty well learned on the topic, but that was awesome. And really, I think, what I take away from that is really such admiration for Bancor and what you guys are doing, because I think that when you look at a lot of the different projects, really the ones you want to either participate in or invest in, or kind of at the very least keep your eye on, are the products and projects that, when something goes wrong or something goes kind of less than desired, let's say, the ability to pivot, the ability to listen to the community, the ability to really do what you're doing, where you're kind of taking stock of what's working, what's not, what's desired, what's not, what's a deal breaker. I thought that was a really cool kind of way to look at it, of like, hey, what do we need to focus on here from a user perspective? Because it's not always the same perspective as the people who are creating the project, or rather running the project. And so I think that there's also, like we talked about before, there's just all that inherent experience in those trials and tribulations. And so, I think that it's like, beyond all of that, there's the courage of, they say pioneers get arrows in their backs sometimes. And, you've seen it with things like MySpace or whatever, but the ability to soldier on and continue creating products that people want and iterating and, just improving is so awesome. And, kind of segueing into my next question, certainly, we at Saffron know about that as well, because we've had issues, but, I think that there are other projects that haven't done such a great job with that, or have allowed those moments to kind of overtake them. And I think that that's something actually Bancor and Saffron Finance have in common, where, sometimes when things don't go right, that is the opportunity. That is where you really want to seize the moment and stand up and fix things, or do an even better job. And that's where you'll score more points and potentially come up even higher than you were previously, where you thought you were going to be. So like I was saying, obviously it is a Saffron Academy podcast. So I was just wondering, as most of our listeners, at least I sure hope they know this, SFI was just recently whitelisted over on Bancor. And I was just wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about how that came to be? Did you have any relationship with Psykeeper that led to this, or what was like the genesis of that kind of happening?
Yeah, so the Bancor community is pretty welcoming of any projects that want to become whitelisted. There is a very well defined governance process. There's a vetting period. There's a questionnaire that we have to make sure that the token itself conforms to certain standards. But I think that the genesis of Saffron ending up on Bancor, there is an existing collection of users that are heavily invested in both projects. And so that the conversation, I see Saffron Finance discussed in our own community channels quite frequently, long before the whitelisting vote came up. And so I think that, in the beginning, I think a lot of the users that were that were kind of following Saffron and interested in that project, they were around when version 2.1 sort of first started getting up off the ground. And in those early phases of the project, of Bancor's project, the the whitelisting process was pretty troubled. We had some fairly large stakeholders that had a very a considerable voting majority behind them that would basically vote against every single whitelisting proposal that came up. And if people are some of the Saffron users may know who this person is. I'm not going to mention them. They did mean well, but their approach to cryptocurrency is very polarizing. They basically said that they will vote down every single proposal, and explain that they're going to vote down every single proposal ahead of time. They used their Twitter account. They were a very prominent Twitter, crypto Twitter influencer until their account was deleted earlier this year. But they would announce that they're going to vote against it in order to encourage, outside communities to buy BNT and then stake it for the VBNT in order to earn, voting rights in the hope of being able to defeat them. So they meant well, but it's just a very abrasive, backwards way of supporting the project.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
And they had they were well known. They didn't just terrorize Bancor. They were terrorizing a large number of projects that they were involved in. Back in the beginning, I think that the Saffron community members that we already had, they were kind of cautious about launching into a whitelisting proposal too soon. Saffron was still relatively new. It hadn't really had that time to sort of become, to kind of season itself in DeFi. And I don't mean that in an offensive way, by the way.
No, not at all.
Yeah, this is just something that all projects have to go through, is that Bancor is still accused of being a scam. Every single new project at first gets looked at with skepticism.
Yeah, very highly scrutinized. Certainly.
Exactly. And I think, in a way that's very healthy. Crypto people are very used to people trying to steal money from them. And so that, being scrutinized, as you put it, is definitely, maybe something of a euphemism. I'd say that, sometimes new projects can just get outright attacked and sometimes that can be a little destructive. Yeah. But when a project is in that period, it's probably not the best time to be, to be voting on a whitelisting proposal, because what you're really doing is you're inviting people to sort of comment and, analyze and scrutinize something that really hasn't had the chance to get its feet under it yet. And so I think that the Saffron Finance community members within Bancor's community, they had the foresight and understanding to kind of let Saffron breathe for a little bit, right? To give it a chance to sort of garner some momentum before we, invite, the thousands of DAO members to start pouring over its finances. So I would say that that's kind of how it started. It was always a part of this background conversation. It was always present. And then people were just kind of waiting for the right moment. And I think it was really just in the last couple of weeks where Saffron Finance has really started to sort of come into its own. It's no longer in this kind of, being accused of being a scam phase. It's now into this, establishing phase where people are like, wow, this is a really interesting project and I'd like to know more about it. And, should I invest money with it? And what's this token and how many can I get? And who else has these tokens and what's the distribution? When people start asking these kinds of questions, it means that you're being taken seriously, right, for the first time. And I think that when we started to see that change in sentiment, that's when the community members were like, okay, now it's time. We can actually, it might even be a good way for Bancor to show its support of Saffron Finance, right? It can actually add momentum to a project now, just by being accepted by the Bancor DAO as being of a caliber that's good enough that we're willing to risk our own token on your success. And so I think that's how it started. We then had, what was his name?
Psykeeper.
Psykeeper, yeah, attended our community call, and was going to discuss Saffron with the community in a very straight way, and that was just leading up to the whitelisting proposal. But yeah, Saffron just flew right through. It was one of the most uneventful whitelisting proposals that we've had. So yeah, I just know that there are already Bancor community members that are heavily invested and very familiar with Saffron. And so if there are anyone listening to the podcast that is considering staking their tokens, and they don't want to be exposed to impermanent loss, which is a common theme between our two protocols. Just know that we've got a liquidity pool set up for you, and I think there's still space in it, and we welcome whoever wants to show up. If you want to talk to me about it first, I'm always present in the channels. And so if this podcast doesn't satisfy any of the questions that your listeners might have, they can always reach out to me, and I can share my contact information with you after this if you want to share it with them.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love that the community members were so astute, really, to realize that, it's almost like when something is new and it's coming out and you want to criticize it, you've got all the ammo in the world, right? You can ask a million questions, you can attack them for, why didn't this happen? Or, is your token a scam? There's so many things you can hurl at a new project,
right.
But till, like you said, it has its feet under it, till it's matured, till it's proven certain things, they don't have ammo to fire back, regardless of how legitimate they are, and even if they do, frequently that won't satisfy, half of the things that they're saying. Whether it should or not is a different debate, but a lot of the time they just don't want to even hear it. They just want to attack. And so to have your community members, realize that patience was required is really so cool, and actually really speaks to all of the things you said previously about having such a great community. So that's awesome. I loved hearing that. And I know we're going a little bit late here, so I'm going to leave you with this last question, which is just a little bit more general, but it's something that I see a lot, and I think it's relevant too with, I know you're in Australia, but obviously we had this crypto bill in the US, or, it was attached to the infrastructure bill. And I know a lot of people, there's varying degrees of regulation that they're okay with. Some people think that regulation is good because it legitimizes crypto, and anything that the government is getting a piece of, is worthy of the government protecting, etc., which is all great. But I think the one thing that really stuck out to people, that really bothered people, including myself, frankly, about the language in the infrastructure bill regarding crypto was that it really seemed to lack in understanding of the technology, of the space. And so I think, listen, some people, to go back to our previous conversation about people in 2010, 2013, it was like regulation is the, kryptonite, the last thing you want. That's not really the case anymore. We're okay with reasonable regulation, but you take a look at the language in this, and I wanted to bring this up too, that, I think that it also kind of spills over into pop culture, where you'll see shows kind of use Bitcoin or crypto as they mock it, or it's used as like the dumb young characters, like, I'm going to go buy Bitcoin, ha ha ha. And it's kind of used as a punchline. And I think it all really comes from a lack of understanding. And so what I was wondering is, what do you think? And this is something I ask myself a lot. What do you think, if there are any steps as a community at large, or an industry at large, or sector, what steps can we take to kind of mitigate that and educate people so that they
Right.
understand, we have the advantage of, we know the technology is sound. We know that this is here to stay, but conveying that seems to be more difficult than I personally would have anticipated.
Yeah. I think that there is the 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 lack of understanding on behalf of the governments, and I think the failure to communicate our culture to them. The guilt is shared by both sides, quite frankly. So what? So let's start with the government, because I think it's going to be, your listeners are going to enjoy what I have to say about governments a lot more than what I have to say about them.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that governments they would do well, I think, to really have a look at why cryptocurrency and these public blockchains exist in the first place, right? Because I think that, one of the things that I was paying attention to recently is, I can't remember if it was specifically the bill that you're referring to. It probably was. But I was listening to an SEC official basically say something about how important it is to protect investors and this kind of rhetoric. And it's like, who's going to argue with that? Of course, it's a great thing to protect investors. We do want normal people to have the certainty that the decisions that they make with their money aren't funding a criminal enterprise or something like that. I don't think anyone in their right mind would actually try to argue against that. But it's worth pointing out that the reason why Ethereum, or one of the reasons why Ethereum and DeFi is so successful, is because it's protecting investors from their governments. And I think that is, that's one of the take-home messages that I really wish some of these policymakers, and certainly some of them do, would acknowledge, right? Is that the whole reason why this movement, and I still see cryptocurrency as partially a protest, the whole reason that it has garnered so much momentum so quickly is because there is a common enemy, and that is corrupt governments. And I'm not being specifically critical of the United States, by the way, not at all. I consider my own government to be among the most incompetent and most corrupt in the world. It's becoming increasingly totalitarian, and the kinds of shady tactics that I see, some cryptocurrency projects getting accused of. The Australian government pulls that same shit on a daily basis in terms of diverting funds to their friends, or all of the kinds of things that we don't like to see cryptocurrency projects do, the kinds of things that would cause a huge amount of FUD, that would really shake the trust in the legitimacy of a project. Almost every single government is guilty of all the time.
Yeah. And a lot of people seem to think, a government would never do that.
Which is just so naive. And honestly,
it's insane, yeah.
Yeah, and you don't even have to, it's kind of it's become something of a joke, really, to sort of, pick up some sort of cryptocurrency FUD, and then try and look through just today's newspaper to find out if the government has done exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? You can play, like a bingo game with it. And so, I that's something that I do think that governments need to pay attention to, which is that this thing exists for a reason. Hold on a sec. This thing exists for a reason. It didn't come from nowhere, and their behavior has really given birth to, right, has made cryptocurrency a necessity. And so if they want to become a productive part of this conversation, they do need to address, or at least acknowledge, that they have behaved badly, right? And then meet us halfway, right? This is a consent of the governed sort of argument. And it sucks that in 2021, we're still having this kind of, conversation about, the rights of the ruled. So on the government side, that's what I really want to see, right? learn where this movement came from, acknowledge your wrongdoings, right? Or at least your mismanagement, and then try and meet us halfway. And I'm sure that we can find a way to work together. I have no doubt in my mind that that governments and governments as a whole, not necessarily specific individuals inside it, but governments as a whole and the voting public actually do want the same thing at the end of the day. And so if we can learn to cooperate, I have every confidence that we can achieve it. So now for the cryptocurrency community, one of the things that we need to do together, and this is something that I try to support personally, is we need to learn how to talk to each other better. Our preferred means of communication is things like Twitter. And if you have a look at how people usually converse and then compare that to how cryptocurrency people converse, one is that it's riddled with like in-jokes and cryptic ways of speaking to each other. That it means that the efficiency of our communication between ourselves is highly efficient, but it also makes it extremely insular. And then the other thing is that we're extremely tribal and aggressive. I think that a lot of the early cryptocurrency adopters really came out of these internet societies like 4chan and other things where the regular kind of a polite discourse goes by the wayside pretty quickly. And not only is it acceptable to say extremely offensive things on a regular basis, but even encouraged. And I think that it doesn't put on a very good face for the cryptocurrency community, and certainly it makes it very, very difficult for people that are discovering it for the first time to find something relatable in it. It's I try to stop people from attacking other projects. I really don't like to see I've seen stuff that's akin to online bullying take place when someone learns something about the private life of a cryptocurrency influencer or a project or a team or whatever. And I think that kind of behavior, we really need to start settling down a little bit, because if cryptocurrency is going to become sort of the global phenomenon that it already is, right? It needs to sort of grow into its global presence. And I think that at the end of the day, we need to realize that whatever it looks like, however it behaves, how people perceive it, it comes from us, right? The communities that are responsible for building it. And so if we're badly behaved, right? If we say terrible things and attack each other on Twitter all the time, you shouldn't be surprised when people look at it and say, wow, that is really just a bunch of children with poor impulse control. So if that's what people want cryptocurrency to look like, they're doing a really good job of it. But if you want people to take it seriously and see it for being a legitimate answer to the world's problems, then we need to start treating it that way and dressing it up correctly. I think that's all I have to say about it there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I think if people take one thing away from listening to this podcast, it really should be that, because I agree wholeheartedly across the board with everything you said. And, there's a saying, you teach people how you want to be treated. And it really is. I mean, you just need to take a quick look at crypto Twitter, and everything you say totally rings true. And I don't think anyone's going to push back on that at all, because it is so apparent, and that's part of the problem. And I certainly intend to take that to heart. And I totally agree. I think that a lot of the stuff is, the community's own doing. The flip side of that is a positive is that, to change that is also in our hands. So, hopefully we can spread that message as much as possible, and it can, like you said, kind of mature into the level of growth that we've been experiencing. But I just want to thank you so much, Mark, for coming on. I mean, really, so much. I mean, I've learned so much. I am sure our listeners will learn so much from listening to this. So thank you again. And if you have any socials or anything you want to shout out, like a Twitter, or if it's just the Telegram, that's cool too. But now's the time to do it.
Yeah, actually, I always forget my Twitter handle. Let me just check it right now. Sorry, I've got the memory of a goldfish sometimes.
No,
But
it's all
yeah,
good. It's all good.
but usually, yeah, if you just Google my name, it tends to come up.
Cool.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I'm sure you said you're in the Telegram all the time, right?
yeah, my Twitter handle is my initials MBR Richardson. So capitals MBR and then lowercase ICHARDSON and then the numbers 87. But yeah, just Google my name, it'll come up. I'm usually in the Telegram channels for Bancor, both the main protocol channel, which is our properly supervised and moderated channel, but then also the Bancor liquidity providers, which is more of sort of the less formal, more laid back, price discussion is accepted there, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm in both of those channels, and then there's like 100 other sort of backdoors into different subcultures. If you're in any of those, just search for my name or ask someone if they can share my handle, and you'll find me pretty quickly. But yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you, Zack. This has been a really pleasant podcast. I've enjoyed chatting with you very much. And I really hope that, Bancor and Saffron Finance have a bright future together.
Awesome, man. Thank you again.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to go and rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter at saffronfinance_. We also have communities on Discord and Telegram, and you can find the links to those in the show notes. We'll see you guys next time.